This is Dennis Palumbo, author of the award-winning Daniel Rinaldi Mysteries, and you're listening to the Dark and Stormy Book Club podcast.
Hello, and welcome to episode 186 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. Today we have a conversation with the author, Clay Small. Enjoy.
I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to talk to the author, Clay Small, about his book, The Forger's Forgery. It came out April 20th of this year by River Grove Books. Henry Lindon's flight across the North Atlantic was turbulent and sleepless. His plane had just touched down in Amsterdam, where he's come to work as a visiting professor. Lindon is torn about leaving his troubled wife Marylou behind in Dallas, but relieved and excited to start a new chapter in a lively city. The taxi drops him off at an elegant building at Roetersstraat 8-1, where he's greeted by his university liaison and soon-to-be neighbor, the lovely and spunky art professor, Bernadette Gordon. Lindon discovers that notorious art forger Han van Meegeren, born in 1899, is about to play a part in Lindon's own personal drama. With evil closing in, Lindon, Bernadette, and Marylou find that secrets of the art world may hold the key to settling old scores and putting a predator away for good. Whether you're familiar with the world of Henry Lindon from Arthur Clay Small's first book, Heels Overhead, or this is your introduction to his works, you are in for an exciting and unusual international adventure with characters that will live on in your memory long after you've finished the book. We would like to welcome Clay G. Small to the program. He is the author of a new book called The Forger's Forgery. Welcome, Clay.
Thank you.
Well, Clay, this book is right up our alley. We watched the documentary on Netflix about forgeries, and so we're all in. So tell us about your book.
Okay, and I appreciate you all having me on today, and it keeps me out of the heat here in Dallas. This story follows the protagonist, a Dallas gentleman named Henry Lindon, as he takes a visiting professor position in Amsterdam, where he meets a professor named Bernadette, who is both alluring and complicated. She is an art history professor at the University of Amsterdam. Bernadette has just published a book about Han van Meegeren entitled Perfect Strangers. Van Meegeren became infamous in the late 1940s as the forger of the Great Vermeer. The book's title is taken from a French cafe painting by Van Meegeren called The Perfect Strangers that disappeared after being sold at a 1950 tax auction of all Van Meegeren's possessions. The tax auction of Van Meegeren's possessions is very real. The specific painting, Perfect Strangers, is fiction. Since the painting has disappeared, Henry Lindon and his wife Marylou decide to forge the painting and sell it to a long-term enemy. Along the way, there are numerous twists and turns as the forgery plan is executed and the reader learns about the history of both Vermeer and the great forger Han van Meegeren.
That sounds fascinating. I have watched quite an extensive program about Van Meegeren. I can't pronounce his name as well as you can. He was quite the character.
He was a self-acknowledged syphilitic, alcoholic, drug addict, and serial adulterer.
A fun guy.
He had a great time during the war years in Amsterdam. He became, at that point in time, the richest artist of his time through his forgeries. He owned 37 different properties in Amsterdam. He went from being the most hated man in all of Holland to, according to one newspaper, the second most popular man. My book deals with how that happened.
From what I read, I think, aren't they still discovering some of his works in museums that they thought were originals?
The last time I saw anything about that was a painting that was, I think, somewhere in Maryland, now that I recall, that was supposedly a Vermeer, but that was in the 60s. There are 34 known Vermeers. You can see 33 of them. One was stolen in Boston. Vermeer was a man who had 9 children, painted obviously very slowly, died at 36, totally broke, and leaving only this sampling of paintings behind him.
But they're beautiful paintings. They really are.
Yes, and it's interesting because how Van Meegeren got away with this is he invented a wonderful fantasy. And the fantasy was in part based on reality in that Vermeer had an early oeuvre that was religious scenes. We know of 3 of those paintings. He then went to a different style, which is the one we love, paintings of mostly feminine domestic tranquility. What Van Meegeren said was, well, of course, these paintings don't look like the oeuvre that we all love because they're examples of his earlier paintings. And sure enough, the public fell for it, and these paintings were sold at astronomical prices.
Tell us a little bit about your protagonist, Henry Lindon. He's in your other book, Heels Over Head.
Yes, he is.
Starts his adventure. Would you tell us a little bit about him and his character?
Henry is a professor at a leafy campus in Dallas, Texas called Sutherland University. He is an ex-attorney and an ex-businessman.
I wonder where you got your
idea.
You know, I'll tell you, I know how much you all love Agatha Christie.
Oh,
and
yeah.
one of her quotes that I like as much as any is, all fiction is largely autobiographical, and much of autobiography is, of course, fiction.
I love that. Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes.
Henry tends to go to the places I go to. I have been to Amsterdam. I think I'm going to go the week of October 10th, where I teach at VU University. This will be my 23rd trip.
Wow.
So I have long been a fan of Amsterdam in general and 17th century Dutch painters in particular.
Well, that kind of answered my next question. What drew you to write about this? Considering what's your background.
My background is very much like Henry's. What drew me to this particular subject goes back literally 20 years. When I was first put in charge of the European attorneys, I had a meeting in London. When I got the bill, I realized it was more than half of my total T&E budget for the year. And so I looked around for a way to have a less expensive meeting. And my dear friend Christa van der Pavard, who is of course Dutch, said, come to Amsterdam. It's 1/3 the price of London and everyone speaks English. So that's what I started doing. And I started having all the European meetings in Amsterdam, where one day I was wandering through the Rijksmuseum and I came across 2 paintings that basically became an obsession with me. One is The Milkmaid by Vermeer, and the other is Little Street, also by Vermeer, that hang in the Rijksmuseum. So I became very interested in Vermeer, and I have seen 30 of his paintings, and I've gone all over the place to see them. Then one day I was reading the Amsterdam newspaper, which is also printed in English. I do not speak Dutch. And I saw an advertisement for an art show in Rotterdam featuring a forger's painting. And I said to myself, who goes to art exhibits to see forgers' works? I went up to Rotterdam, and there were 12 of Van Meegeren's forgeries. Some of them were Vermeer's, others were by other Dutch artists, all 17th century Dutch artists. And I just became curious about who this guy is, why are people interested in him, and how did he do it? That began what ended up being the forger's forgery.
Could you, with your eye, see the difference between the paintings of Van Meegeren and Vermeer?
When you see some of the Van Meegeren forgeries, you would be incredulous that people were fooled. They are okay paintings, but they have none of the majesty of a Vermeer. He used the same colors, he used the same kind of paints. Van Meegeren was an artisan in a lot of ways, and he duplicated exactly the paint mixtures that Vermeer used. And he also made a technological discovery, which was that back in the 30s and 40s, the main way of authenticating whether a painting was a newly forged painting or from the 17th century was simply to dip cotton in alcohol and rub it on the canvas. And if it was new, the paint would rub off. What Van Meegeren discovered was he took an early plastic called Bakelite, which you mostly see in pool balls. He crunched it up into a powder, mixed it with his paints, and then over very low heat for many hours, baked the painting. With that method, the cotton and alcohol test became ineffectual.
That's fascinating. But the thing is, today you couldn't do that with all this forensic testing.
Oh, yes. There's just no way. Today, the kind of authentication methods like X-radiography, carbon dating, and all that, there's just no way.
I can't wait to read this book. It sounds really up my alley.
Will there be a third installment?
I'm working on it. One of the things that I think maybe your audience would want to know, there's also an audio version of the book, which is very interesting because the guy who'd read it is named David de Vries out of New York City, but David's parents were both Dutch. He does the Dutch accents perfectly.
Oh, wow. That worked out really well.
So he's gotten an awful lot of press for this. I'm somewhat jealous, but I can't do the Dutch accents.
Do you have a website so our listeners can find you and your books?
Yes, it's claysmall.com.
Oh, nice and easy.
On that website, you will find a variety of interesting things, I believe. Number one, it goes back in time. So like one of the attachments is an article I wrote way back when Michael Jackson died. It was published in the Dallas Morning News about the night I spent in Michael Jackson's bedroom.
What?
Okay.
Oh, do tell.
Now you're going to have to read that, aren't you?
Definitely.
And kind of more relevant to what we're talking about, ladies, is that there's some video of presentations I have made in the last few months. What I present on a thumbnail sketch of great forgers. What fascinates me about these forgers is how the public treats them. These guys are criminals. They have made huge amounts of money through their criminal activity. However, they are thought in the court of public opinion as just being clever rascals ensnarled in a bit of sophomoric tomfoolery. This repeats itself over time, and I give 4 examples of how these men operated, how they got away with it. It's an all-boys club, and it's a boys will be boys kind of thing because there are no famous female forgers.
That you know of.
That's exactly right.
Maybe they're so good.
I'm getting my paintbrush out.
And are they just too good at it to be caught? I don't know.
That's
Mom,
it.
we have no talent.
I know.
Before we go, looking at your past life, shall we say, I bet you have some interesting stories about that time in your life. And I'm going to make a guess here. that when you said you were in Michael Jackson's